Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second Ocean Justice webinar from Ocean and Coastal Futures, OCF, where we'll be exploring the issue of social mobility and class in the marine and coastal sector. This is the second of a series of webinars that Ocean and Coastal Futures will be hosting, generously supported by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. Ocean and Coastal Futures, OCF, is a convener of change in the ocean and coastal sector, and through this series we want to create a space to discuss, debate, and importantly move forward different aspects of ocean justice. We've got an amazing panel which I'll introduce you to shortly. Emily Cunningham MBE, a marine biologist and award-winning ocean conservationist. We have Dr. Rose O'Neill, Chief Executive of the Campaign for National Parks. We also have Alex Gill, member of Young Sea Changers Scotland, and we have Dr. Penelope Griffin, Director at the Bridge Group. Before I get them onto the screen, really, I just want to really briefly take you through what this webinar is all about. And what do we mean by class and social mobility, particularly in a general sense, but then bringing it down to the marine and coastal sector. So before this, I had a quick look at some definitions, really, and just to give them to you. So social mobility, the Cambridge Dictionary says this is the ability to move from one level of society to another. But the UK government uses a definition from the Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission, which says the relationship between our starting point in life and where we end up as adults. And that's usually in relation to income, occupation, and status. Another definition around social mobility. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they state the definition of how a person's socio-economic situation improves or declines relative to that of their parents or throughout their lifetime. And class is Oxford Dictionary defines it as division of society based on social and economic status. George Orwell famously described the Britain as the most class-ridden society under the sun. It is sometimes talked about as a very British term, and we have people here today from right across the world, but very much class and social mobility. We'll be talking about it primarily from a UK context. I'm going to give you a stat here which is really interesting. So in the latest annual British Social Attitudes Report from the National Centre for Social Research, it showed that 77% of people think that social class affects someone's opportunities in Britain. A great deal or quite a lot. So 77% of people think that. Back in 1985, that was 66%. So 10% less thought that someone's class affects their opportunities in the UK. So in other words, you could say it's getting worse. So bring that back to the marine and coastal sector. So social mobility, class, very little is known about that from the ocean and coastal sector. It's really discussed, really. I mean, anecdotally, I think it's pretty clear, certainly in the UK, where I'm talking from today, we know that it's a very white middle class sector. We also know from research that people in lower socio-economic groupings and living in deprived areas are less likely to be accessing blue spaces. Schools, the pathways to blue careers are very poor. Some people are not being encouraged to pursue careers in the marine and coastal sector. And we also know that a very small proportion of people of colour who join the marine and coastal sector, who study marine science, actually come from the highest socio-economic groupings. And we also know that pathways to marine and coastal careers are rife with financial barriers. I think we've all heard about or all read about unpaid or low paid internships, unpaid voluntary experience, the need for a master's degree, or many higher entry-level roles. This is a very timely discussion. Just this last week in The Guardian, social mobility charity the Sutton Trust was citing evidence that young people from working class or disadvantaged backgrounds are being locked out of careers by unpaid or low-paid internships that benefit middle-class graduates. The Sutton Group is actually calling for unpaid internships of 4 weeks or longer to be banned to help close this social mobility gap. So that's a brief introduction. Before I let you hear from our expert panel on this and many other nuances around social mobility and class, just a little bit of housekeeping. So all of you in the audience today, your cameras are off, as you know, and you're muted. There is a chat function, so use this to introduce yourself to each other if you would like. And you can make comments or share resources, etc. But there's also a Q&A function. There should be a Q&A function next to the chat. Please use this to pose any questions. Anything you have to the panel, I'll be keeping an eye on that. And the Q&A function is completely anonymous. If you like a question that someone's posed, you're able to upvote it. And some versions of Teams, you may have problems using this, so please use the chat, and the team in the background will move some of those questions into the Q&A. So I'd now like to welcome the panel. If the panel could put themselves on screen, if they could put their cameras on and start to turn on their microphones, and we will welcome you all. It's good to see you all. Thank you. So as I said earlier, we have an excellent panel with us today. Emily Cunningham, Penelope O'Neill, Penelope Griffin, sorry, Rosie O'Neill, and Alex Gill. Hi, Alex, nice to see you. I'd just like to run through each of you. You've got a chance to speak now. And I think, Emily, you're going to introduce yourself and give some background. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you very much, David. Is this where I share my screen?
Hopefully, yes.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So good afternoon to you all. Thank you, David, and to Rosie for organising today's session. I'm really honoured to have been given the opportunity to speak, not just because it's such an important topic, but because it's one that's very dear to my heart personally. And I wanted to start with this photo, and I wonder if anyone recognises where this picture was taken. So this is a photo of the Coastal Futures Conference a few years ago. And I don't mean to pick on Coastal Futures, but it really illustrates the issue that we're here to talk about today. So as David said, the environmental sector is the second least diverse in Britain. It's overwhelmingly white and it's overwhelmingly middle class. In photos like this one, we can see the whiteness, but it's hard to see the classness. And so I'm really grateful to Ocean and Coastal Futures for organising today's webinar to discuss this forgotten dimension of diversity, which is class. And I will say from the start that class is not synonymous with socio-economic background either. We're often shy away from using the word class when we talk about this issue, but it is a significant factor in social mobility in our sector and more broadly in the UK. And ignoring the word class won't make the inequality go away. And so 51% of people in the UK identify as working class, and I am one of them. So I'm going to share my own story to illustrate the points I would like to make very briefly. So I'm from Staffordshire, if you couldn't tell from my accent. I'm the descendant of a lineage of miners and potters, some of whom were so illiterate they couldn't even write their own names. And I was lucky that once a year we would go on a caravan holiday to the seaside. So my mum and dad would collect the holiday tokens out of the Sun newspaper so we could go. And that's a sign of your class if you know about the £9.50 Sun caravan holidays to Haven. But it was the best thing in the whole world. And I looked forward to it all year. And it's no doubt where my fascination with the sea came from. So from about the age of 8, I knew I wanted to be a marine biologist. But I knew I was lucky. So even today, 1 in 5 children in the UK have never seen the sea. And that includes children from coastal towns. And so I often wonder what job I'd be doing now if it weren't for these early childhood seaside experiences. And most little girls outgrow their ambition to become a marine biologist, but mine stuck through these awkward teenage years, despite the very best efforts of my teachers and my careers advisor to choose a more realistic career path. I was told, and this is a quote, "You expect too much from life," as if state-schooled working class kids aren't allowed to dream big. But luckily I have stubbornness on my side, and so I became the first person in my family to go to university when I went to Bangor in North Wales to study marine biology. And in our welcome lecture at the School of Ocean Sciences, we were told that less than 10% of us would find work in the sector. So I decided I would do whatever it took to make sure I was one of the ones that made it. And for me, that meant volunteering my little socks off alongside my studies and also working 2 part-time jobs. I worked as a student support worker by day and I was a pot washer by night. I wasn't very good at being a waitress. But all of my volunteering was local. It cost nothing, but I was crushingly jealous of the few people that got to go and do those pay to volunteer or paid internships. Mostly the people on my course at Bangor were from backgrounds like mine, first generation students from the Midlands or the North West or North Wales. And it's at Bangor that I met my now husband, Dr. Daniel Moore, who's also a working class Midlands kid. He's there on the left of the photo. And we didn't realise it at the time, but the fact that we got to university at all was really significant. So the most disadvantaged group in modern Britain is white working class boys. So here's my husband, with his permission, sharing his school photo, a white working class boy from Skegness, which is a typical coastal town on the East Coast. He's now a brilliant marine scientist, but he's an anomaly. Just 12.7% of white working class boys progress to higher education. And for white working class girls, it's still only 19%. And if you compare this with the more than 50% of Black African or South Asian pupils who are in receipt of free school meals that go on to progress to higher education. And so my dad says that the day that I, and then 2 years later, my sister, who you can see there with me, the day that we graduated was the proudest of his life. And there's a lot of pressure as a first generation graduate. Your family expect that you'll earn a lot of money and lift the rest of the family up. But we all know that's not really the case in our sector. And it came to turn out that getting to uni was the relatively easy part. It was the getting a paid job in the marine and coastal sector bit that was a major barrier for those of us with no connections, no roadmap, no one to ask for directions, and certainly no money to do unpaid internships. As David said already, the research from the Sutton Trust recently shows that 36% of working class young people have undertaken an unpaid internship compared to 55% of middle class young people. But I just thought that's how it is. It's hard for everyone. Forging a career is hard for everyone. Well, that is until my partner Daniel started his PhD at Durham University. And there, like an absolute lightning bolt, I was exposed to a world of privilege. At the first formal dinner that we went to, as they read Grace in Latin, I realised how naive I'd been. I learned about family networks, jobs lined up after graduation, parents paying their rent for them, or even funding them through unpaid internships. And I realised for the first time how uneven the playing field really is. And so in the UK, family income is still the strongest predictor of how well a young person will do at school and the future opportunities they will have. And those experiences in the dining hall at Durham a few years ago now, they lit an absolute fire in me. And I realised that I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to change things so it wasn't as hard for everyone as it had been for me. And so first I changed jobs to one that worked with deprived coastal communities in Northern England to engage them in marine and coastal conservation, and then became the Marine Conservation Society's first ever equity, diversity and inclusion lead in my role on their board of trustees. I became a careers mentor for A Focus on Nature and Future Frontiers, which is a social mobility charity. And through the Motion for the Ocean, which I co-founded, we've secured commitment from over 30 councils in England that all primary school age children will get a first-hand experience of the ocean before they leave primary school, including homeschooled children. And all of this really matters because the coastal communities that we work with and in have some of the highest levels of deprivation in the UK. These areas are predominantly white and working class. And it's through all of this work over the past 5 or 6 years that I've come to realise that growing up working class is one of my greatest strengths for a career in the marine and coastal sector. Because of my lived experience, I know how to engage with people in coastal communities. I know how to be resourceful and responsible with limiting funding. And I can authentically represent the challenge of life in a coastal or deprived community when I'm meeting with ministers and parliamentarians, which I have the honour to do. And a few years ago, I chaired a meeting with MPs to discuss the problem of coastal deprivation. One of the MPs said, young people in coastal areas are just lacking in ambition. And that drives me forward to this day. And so as we start this conversation, I want everyone to remember that tackling the class problem in our sector isn't a nice to have. It's not only the right thing to do, it's also absolutely mission critical. And that lecturer at Bangor Uni was right, by the way. Less than 10% of my peers have made their career in this space. It's such a waste of talent and of potential, and it's to the detriment of our sector and the work we're trying to do. So just because it was hard for us to forge our way, it doesn't mean it should be hard for the next generation, and it's up to all of us to extend the ladder. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to learning from the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Emily. That was great. It's really interesting, a really great introduction to yourself. And without wishing to talk about stereotypes, so you're from Staffordshire, a family of potters. I'm from South Wales, a family of miners. So let's get that out of the way, get the stereotypes out of the way. Thanks, Emily. Rose, would you like to come on and say some words?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for hosting this such important webinar. And wow, Emily, that was just so much resonated with me in that speech. Really, really powerful. So I'm Rose, I'm Chief Executive of an independent charity called Campaign for National Parks. And I will talk about some of our work in a minute about this relevant to this topic, including our new National Marine Parks work stream being led by Fionn Mitchell-Langford. But first, I just wanted to share some of my personal thoughts. So, as Emily said, sort of class, poverty and deprivation are very, very real issues alive in the UK today. And there's nowhere really more so than the coastal towns and cities, which in many ways have long been neglected in terms of the policy agenda and levelling up. And there's a huge weight of evidence, including a really seminal House of Lords report more recently, that just shows that coastal towns are characterised by low pay, poor housing, high unemployment, low levels of educational attainment, poor health outcomes, and older and more transient populations. But at the same time, these communities have a very deep and proud connection to the sea. And I know that because of my research. I used to work as a social scientist in Natural England, but I know this firsthand from growing up in Portsmouth, which is where I'm joining you from now. I grew up in a council estate in Paulsgrove, which is one of the most deprived parts of Portsmouth, but also one of the most deprived wards in the country. And what I want to say about that is actually I had a really, really great childhood. It was a great place to grow up in many ways. And the sea was a really important part of that. But there's no bones about it. My family and everyone on our street, we were absolutely skint. And that had very real connotations of, growing up. But the sea was a very, very important part of my family story. So my dad used to tell this story about, he used to work in the dockyard in Portsmouth, and he would talk about when the whistle went at the end of the day, hundreds of men on bikes would just leave the dockyard at the same time. And that is just almost hard to imagine today when I think of Portsmouth, because like so many industrial coastal communities, that work just completely dried up. By the mid 80s, when I was starting school, that my dad had to change jobs, and he actually supplemented his income by going clamming, out picking up clams out of the harbour and selling them to the fish the fish market, which was actually quite a common thing that men in the family did. And what was interesting to me, like that was just normal to me, and I actually just had an absolutely great time, just mucking around on the beach and looking for crabs and playing on wrecks of boats and that kind of thing. So I do think, with that in mind, I do sort of flinch when we talk about as a sector that we need to reconnect people with the sea, because I think that actually so many of these coastal communities have such a deep connection and a long connection, and it's just very different perhaps to the imagery that we use in the sector. So it's about walking on the prom and going down the arcades, or looking at the ships that are out in the Solent that are coming in, or recreational fishing, those kinds of activities, which are sometimes ones that can be sort of snobbily looked down on as like the wrong way to experience the sea. So back to me. So through sort of like Emily, really juggling education and work, and then becoming a manager in Portsmouth City Council, and then lots of sideways moves, I managed to get into this sector, and I've ended up in my role at Campaign for National Parks, which is a role that I never knew existed when I was a kid. And what I really love about Campaign for National Parks is the fact that this is a movement, or this is an organisation that was born out of a radical working class struggle. So, it was the factory workers in the 1930s that rose up and demanded access to land that led to the founding of the national parks in England and Wales. And when I heard that story for the first time, it was just so incredibly powerful to me, because so often, you know, people from my background, the stories we hear are about broken Britain, you know, but to hear a story of a working class movement that founded national parks for nature, cultural heritage, public access, that was so important. So today at Campaign for National Parks, we are thinking really hard about how we can rekindle and tap into those radical roots and really put social justice at the heart of everything that we do. Our strategy is about making national parks better for nature, wilder, but it's also about making national parks equal, so everyone can have a, you know, no matter what your background is, you can access, but also have a say about how these places are run. And we're really interested in more national parks and more ways to connect people to land and sea. So looking back to the end of the war and when national parks were created, due to a whole bunch of political horse trading, actually the sea was left out of the national park story. And like many coastal communities like Tenby, Minehead and Prestatyn are either being left out or being left out of national parks as the boundaries are being cut, skirt round those deprived towns. So that's why I'm really excited when I heard about the National Marine Park project that was being developed at Plymouth Sound, and the initiative there, a model that really puts people at the centre. And so we've been really working with the Plymouth Sound team, but also with Blue Marine, and we were really excited to think about how we could take that forward and scale up that model to other parts of the country. How do we bridge between the work that we as a sector do on nature designations? How do we bridge to coastal communities to deliver more for both? So if you're interested in that, and you're interested in how we might scale up and develop this model further, please get in touch with Fionn, and I'm sure she'll put our contact in the chat. And then finally, for me, I was really moved by Emily's story, as I'm sure many of you are, and I've just found the more I talk about my background, the more that I've actually found that there are lots of people from similar backgrounds in this sector, or there are lots of people working to help and support people from similar backgrounds break into this sector. And I actually think, looking at the statistics on social mobility and talking to young people today, I think it's much harder actually now than it was for me 20 years ago to break into this sector. So I'm really interested about how we build a community or a network and work together to address it. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Rose. That's great. I love the image of the people leaving the shipyards on their bikes and the clams as a kind of supplementary income. It's really interesting. Thank you for that. Penelope, would you like to? Hi, Penelope.
Hi.
Over to you. I know you've got some screens we're going to share for you in a second.
Lovely. Thanks very much. So I'm absolutely delighted to be contributing to the seminar today. I'm from the Bridge Group. We're a non-profit consultancy. We do research to promote social equality. And we do this by supporting organisations of all kinds with independent expertise, research and practical advice. I'm going to give a brief overview of some apparent issues that might be getting in the way of social mobility in the sector, as well as some practical steps to take in addressing them. You'll see that I refer to these as perceived issues, apparent issues, and that's because I haven't really been able to find the evidence to know for certain. And David, you did mention it in your introduction, that the lack of evidence that we have. Could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so there is the perception that the marine and coastal sector lacks in diversity, but we don't really know. So a very practical first step you can do to help inform your planning is to gather data on the socio-economic background of the workforce. Emily, you mentioned class, and that's an absolutely vital part of all of this. I'm recommending when we're collecting data, to use socio-economic background, which is parental occupation at age 14, just because it's easier to, it's clearer for people to decide on a category, and there's sort of an evidence base there for them to do that, whereas different people can have different ideas about class and what their class is. I popped a Mark Twain quote in there. At least it's referring to a river which flows into the sea. And yeah, you've got to know the shape of the river. So if you want to navigate a situation, you need to know what it looks like. If you want to find out more about collecting socio-economic data on socio-economic background, and if you want toolkits and more, then please do look at that link that I've put in there. Specifically look at the employers toolkit that we developed for the Social Mobility Commission. There are other measures that you can use, like free school meals and state school, but and those help as well. But I'm thinking particularly if employers are already doing a survey on, for example, disability, ethnic background, gender, then this, and you want just one question, you want to keep the survey short, then just pop in that question on parental occupation. There is also a perception that the pipeline lacks diversity. And it was interesting getting Emily's view. At Bangor, most students were like her. At Durham, most weren't, it seems. There too, you can get data to find out where you are. If you're from a university, you may well already have this data. If you don't have the data, then ask your planning department, ask your widening participation, your widening access team, because usually that's available, at least for larger courses, maybe not for every small course. You should also look at your entry requirements. Which qualifications do you need? Do you want A-levels, or do you accept a wider range of qualifications? If you want to do outreach, really important in view of that statistic about what was it, 1 in 10, 1 in 5 young people haven't even been to the sea. Yeah, then collaborate with your university outreach, again, if possible, with the widening participation team, the widening access team, because they'll put you in touch with the target group, people from less advantaged backgrounds. Course marketing is really important. I know that that's an issue in geography. A lot of potential geography students are put off by the fact that they think the only thing they can do with a geography degree is to become a geography teacher, and they also think you have to pay for expensive field trips. So yeah, if it's the same with marine science, certainly with other field trips in there, make it very clear, do students have to pay for that? If they do, is there support available from the university? In relation to making very clear what the jobs there are, can employers and universities collaborate on this? So course marketing should include graduate outcomes data if it doesn't already, and case studies of students from diverse backgrounds, now graduates, working in the sector. It is also helpful to build contact with potential employers into the curriculum. So, for example, can employers provide site visits? Can they provide topics for final year projects? Could there be some vacation placements? Sorry, I was just going to say, if you, in relation to the data, I understand that Portsmouth University carried out a study, and that showed that 11% of undergraduates on marine science courses were from a polar quintile 1 postcode. So that's deemed as a group who are least likely to participate. So generally less advantaged students. That's actually quite close to the national average of 12%, but that's not actually a very good comparison. Ideally, you need to compare like for like. So if you are from a university, compare a marine science course with another science course within the same university to see how you're doing. Okay, next slide, thank you. Okay, so there is the perception that the sector itself doesn't attract applicants, so it's a problem of attracting people to apply for jobs in the first place. The toolkit I mentioned on the previous page, that's got useful tips in it about attraction. Yeah, in summary, clarify entry routes and experience required. Make sure people don't think that they have to have a powerboat license or whatever I don't know what all the misperceptions are, but make it very clear. If possible, provide case studies of people on your website from a range of backgrounds. If there is an issue about people not having the right qualifications, or perhaps you want to encourage people to move sideways within the sector from one part to another part, can universities or colleges provide certificate level or short courses to support that? Now, I'm thinking as a model of the University of Lincoln's National Centre for Food Manufacturing, that's based at a satellite campus in Holbeach in Lincolnshire. And the aim of that is to help local people upskill so that they can move into higher skilled jobs in the local area. And there's a particular focus on supporting SMEs with that. If employers were indeed building on, involved in the curriculum, then yeah, it's quite an easy move then to have the employers keeping students informed of jobs that are coming up in the local area. We also suggest employers liaise with career services of local universities and each other for example, over representation at careers fairs. Last point, there's the perception that the workplace itself doesn't support diversity. So is retention an issue in the sector? And really, yeah, again, you need to gather evidence. So if you are routinely collecting information about socioeconomic background, then you can monitor whether retention varies by socioeconomic background. Again, yeah, look at that toolkit, and there's more detail about this. I think really clear leadership within an organisation is required. And key points are just creating opportunities for employees to engage with the agenda and to share views and experiences. And that is all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Penelope. That was great. It's really interesting, the toolkit and the misconceptions around qualifications you mentioned there. So we'll come back to some of that later, I think. I'd like to invite Alex back on the screen if you can do that. Let's see if we can get.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, Alex. Hello. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Sorry about that. You know how tech is when you try to get to work, it always something seems to go wrong last minute. So yeah, but I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to this, and I'm glad I can actually speak now. So yeah, all right, let me just get my little timer up because I don't want to run over time. Okay, so I just wanted to do sort of a bit of my own personal background, how I sort of got involved in this sector, and yeah, because I suppose we're talking about equity, and one of the things, as noted by other people here, it is not a very diverse sector. It is quite homogenous in a sense. So going back to me, my background is I grew up in care in a sort of working class community. And I suppose my love for the sea derived from, well, every year I would go on holiday to the borders in Scotland, and that was sort of the highlight of my year. It was a good way to sort of just disconnect from everything that was going on. So that's where it sort of started from. But my actual involvement, I wasn't actually exposed much to the conservation sort of environmental sector growing up. It wasn't something I was taught in school. I remember having one science class in school, and that's as much as I got. And I wasn't really exposed to it again. I wasn't aware that a sector like this really existed at all. So how I did get involved is I actually first and foremost got involved in politics. And as most of us know, the environment is inextricably linked to politics. So I got a position in politics mostly by volunteering, and that sort of opened up a whole new world to me. I met people from different backgrounds and people specifically involved in sort of the conservation sector, and that's sort of what opened my eyes to this whole thing. So I got involved in Young Sea Changers as outlined, because I came across it by accident on social media, and I was like, you know what, that sounds interesting, I'll give that a go. So I attended one of their events, and it was really interesting. I learned a lot about the problems that Scotland faces, particularly around the way we manage our fisheries. And it was something that it clicked with me. It's something I realised I was super interested in. One of the things I observed, though, get involved in politics and the marine space, as I said before, it is a very homogenous space. And this isn't just from, if we're talking, ethnically, just also socially. I've not met a single person that comes from a similar background to me. It's mostly middle class, usually privately educated individuals. And when I got involved, I wouldn't say I felt necessarily unwelcome. That wasn't the case. I didn't feel welcome, but I never felt excluded either. I just felt a bit out of place. And fortunately, personally, for someone like me, that is, it's not really a bother. I like being in those types of spaces, but I could see how that could be off-putting for people that want to get involved. So, what can be done? Quite frankly, I don't think I have the answers. I just wanted to give my own sort of personal story and how I got involved. But I think generating sort of broad awareness of the sector would be a start, especially when people are young, particularly in school. I think that would be a good way to start. Because as I said, I did not know that this sector existed until, I just sort of came across it on accident. And one of the things is, so many people our age are anxious about stuff when it comes to the climate. And the reason I like this sector is it feels like there's something you can do about it. And I think that's a great value proposition, the idea that, I think is a great value proposition that many young people, if they're aware of, would love to partake in. I also think focusing less on sort of the career aspect of it would be good. One of the observations I've made is that a lot of people in the space are, looking to get a job, and while that's perfectly fine, it can be pretty off-putting for people that are just starting to get involved and are involved due to their, deeply held beliefs. I'm getting pretty sick of being asked for my LinkedIn whenever I'm involved, So I think it's important that whilst my input can be of some value, I'm not the norm. I'm a bit of a outlier in that case. And yes, through a bit of luck and hard work, I managed to break into this space. But I think it is important we do take active measures and do make this space more inclusive for people of all backgrounds. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. I'm really glad we got you on the screen. That's really, really interesting. And it's also really interesting to me when you said you kind of could feel out of place, but it didn't bother you too much. I think it's pretty clear that to other people it does bother them quite a lot, which is kind of unfortunate, really, that they do feel kind of uncomfortable, etc. But you've obviously got the personality to override that, really, which is really good. So I just want to point out to everybody watching, just to encourage you to post some questions in the Q&A. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. But I just wanted to start with a question, probably to come back to you, Emily. You may have even touched on this at the beginning, really, and if anybody else has got a view. I guess, why do you think we're perhaps, certainly in the UK, but elsewhere, we're uncomfortable talking about social mobility, or certainly uncomfortable about talking about class? What do you think it is that holds us back? And even Alex kind of touched on it as well.
That's a really good question. And I imagine there's as many different answers as there are people on this webinar and people in the UK. But I think what's interesting for me is I'd never identified as working class until I was exposed to another world. I just thought I was normal. And then when I found out that there was this class structure and that was what had made it harder for some of us and easier for others, that was when I kind of got excited about, could this be a vehicle for change? And so I was like, well, let's lean into this. Let's lean into this, term. But it is interesting that people are still so visibly uncomfortable when, like, I think we talk about it. I don't need to be working class. I'm proud of being working class. I don't mind talking about it. It's not like, oh, I'm working class. It's quite the opposite. But I do find that for some people, they still find it incredibly uncomfortable, which is why we lean into things like socio-economic background or whatever, all of these different things. And I appreciated what Penelope said about, okay, it's a socioeconomic background from a data point of view can help compare across different experiences because there's something more tangible about that. But class is, I think it's as much a mentality as it is a descriptor. And so I would like us to talk about it because I think that's the way that we increase visibility, increase this kind of working class pride, which is, I think, a big part of it for me, like the state school proud. I'm state school proud as well. And so I feel like we need to destigmatize it so that we can have constructive conversations to understand why we have got to this point. But I struggle to understand why people find it uncomfortable because I personally don't find it uncomfortable to talk about it. And would love to know what the other speakers think about that as well.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, it's a really good point you made, isn't it, really? When I guess when one is young, that's all one knows, isn't it? It's only when you're exposed to a wider circle of people you start to kind of compare yourself or even put yourself into a category almost. Does anybody else have a thought on that question around why it's perhaps difficult or not talked about much? Penelope, thank you.
Yeah. So I think there are a number of reasons. Partly it involves money, and people in England generally don't like talking about money. But also I think in a lot of contexts, people have, in some sectors, in some jobs, in some professions, the dominant culture is just different. And so you are going to be in a minority if you are from a working class background, from a less advantaged background. And often to do well in your new job, you have to assimilate to some extent. You have to dress in a particular way. You have to maybe modify your accent a bit. All sorts of adjustments you might want to have to do, and and intentionally or not, other employees from different backgrounds can make you feel uncomfortable. They probably, most of them don't mean anything by it, but these sorts of microaggressions can actually make conversations about class and social background really uncomfortable. I think it's an absolutely changeable, it can change. It's not set in stone. So you will find that within the legal sector, within the professional services sector, so big firms like PwC, KPMG, big law firms, which in the past have been pretty much dominated by people from more advantaged backgrounds, are now having conversations about this and doing a great deal and really making progress about this. So you can normalize discussions of social identity within a workplace, within a profession, so that people can feel more comfortable about it.
Thanks, Penelope. Rose, Alex, do you want to add anything? Alex?
Yeah, you can hear me, right? I just need to make sure everything. Okay. Sorry. I think one of the things, in my opinion, I think we like to see ourselves as a, sort of meritocratic society, and this discussion about the influence that class plays can be uncomfortable because it sort of challenges that notion that people are in positions due to how qualified they are. So I think that is one of the reasons that we are uncomfortable. It sort of just goes against the way we like to see ourselves.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, I'll move on. There's a question in the Q&A on the side there, really. I mentioned it in my opening, really, that the recent research, or the recent point coming from, I think it was the Sutton Trust, published this week, saying that all internships, or rather all unpaid internships over 4 weeks, should be banned. Now, I think you mentioned about volunteering, and you did as well, Emily, and perhaps there's a difference between volunteering and unpaid internships. But I guess, what do you think about that, really? Do you think they should be banned? And perhaps, what, as the question is asked, really, what alternatives would people suggest to tackling the issues of inequality within these kind of opportunities?
Can I come in, David, on this one?
Please do, yeah.
I mean, I think that they should be banned, or at least, all progressive charities that feel like they should be, that are and organisations in this space should not be reliant on that as a way of people coming into the sector, because it is so exclusive. And actually, so many organisations are already moving down that road, which is good to see. And beyond that, I mean, for example, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot at Campaign for National Parks is we've been running these free leadership training courses for young people, and we need to make sure that we take away all of the barriers, so we pay people to travel and all of that. So it's about how do you understand those barriers and make make progress. And I thought Penelope had some really good advice. The kind of things that we've been doing also as an organisation are things like, really making sure our recruitment practices don't require volunteer experience or X years experience or a degree. We're really looking at really challenging ourselves. What skills do we need for these roles? So I think that's really important. And then I just wanted to pick up on something Emily said, which, and there's a theme in the chat, is sort of not what you know, but it's who you know. And I also think that that's something that we just really need to be really acknowledge and explicit, that is actually how a lot of the way of work works. And when I was really lucky when I was in the civil service to join the social mobility network that was running in the civil service, and they did a lot of research that just showed that was how people got on to the top of the civil service. You just wouldn't get on unless you actually knew people and they were able to mentor you. And I look back when I was a kid, I didn't really know anyone that wore a suit to work, let alone could mentor me to. And so I think that not only do we need to ban those unpaid internships, we need to think about how do we create networks and opportunities for people to meet people and allow them to get on.
Thanks. Alex, do you have a view on the kind of the internships, or even Emily, because I'm sure you will have done those kind of internships or unpaid internships in the past, and maybe they helped you, maybe you didn't like it, but did they help? So I wonder what your view about stopping unpaid internships.
I'm happy to talk about this. I do think there is a difference between voluntary work and unpaid internships. I think unpaid internships can often be highly exploitative. I got into my first job working for a politician through volunteering, so I do think there are definite benefits, and I think they are a bit, one of the good things about volunteering, especially sort of open volunteer where anyone can just show up and do whatever it does remove those barriers. It's a good way to, I suppose, I don't like the term, but network, to get into contact with those people that can help you out with getting those types of jobs. So yeah, I'm in favour of volunteering. It's benefited me greatly, but unpaid internships, I do think they should be banned.
Right.
Yeah, if I may come in, I echo what's already been said in that I unpaid internships should be banned. It is challenging, those of us who work in the sector and are looking at our year-end budgets now and are going, oh my gosh, how am I going to keep delivering this service? It is very tempting to look at the pipeline of people who are desperate for experience and go, maybe we could create something here. But those internships must be properly remunerated, and not just considering how much we pay people, but recognizing that people have to move. People might not have the kind of financial safety net to be able to say, well, I can just moved to the other side of the country. This, there's all these things we need to think about. And actually, it's not just the social equality thing, it's the social equity thing. How do we meet that gap to make sure that the best candidates are able to access those opportunities? And I completely agree with what Alex said about volunteering as well. So my volunteering was, instrumental in me moving from a graduate to a paid graduate, but it was actually my job, my part-time job I did at uni, that got me my first job at the Environment Agency, because I had experience of a workplace, because I'd had to work during my degree. But the volunteering, I think it's often different to an unpaid internship, or any kind of internship, because it's like you choosing to pursue things to skill yourself up to make yourself as employable as possible. So I think there is an element of that which we can encourage, but it's recognizing within that, if we as the sector are taking on volunteers, to again make sure that it's non-exploitative, that we can support with things like travel costs or other barriers that might make volunteering inaccessible. But for unpaid internships, come and work in London for however many months for free, absolutely, that needs to get in the bin forever. That needs to go away.
David, can I also come in here? I mean, I was just really quite surprised by the Sutton Trust data, because this issue has been around for, I don't know, 15 years plus, I would say. Alan Milburn, so former MP who became the social mobility czar, he, I believe, introduced a code of practice that organisations were encouraged to sign up to, which was basically banning unpaid internships. So, but obviously it just takes a while for that to filter down, particularly in smaller organisations.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. The question really and it links to the question in the Q&A really about, I wonder if any of you have got a view around where social mobility sits within kind of intersectionality. There's a question there talking about, there's race and disabilities, ethnicity, sexuality. So I guess, do we need to be talking about, or rather, do we need to be tackling the social mobility issue separately, or looking at it through this wider lens of intersectionality and other issues to get that true social justice and ocean justice? Would anybody like to have a crack at that?
I'm happy to say something about it, David. So at the Bridge Group, we, when we're working with an organisation, typically we will gather quantitative data, often about, workforce, about progression, seniority, and then also qualitative data through interviews. And the quantitative data is very clear that where is intersectionality, so for example, if you are from a Black background and also a lower socio-economic background, then that compounds the disadvantage that you experience in the workplace. So if you're looking at the time it takes for people to get promoted, then white men get promoted fastest, Black women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds get promoted most slowly. So and then the qualitative data just shows that yes, it is just more than doubly difficult if you have more than one disadvantaging criteria. I think one benefit of looking at socioeconomic background is that it's not to the exclusion of other factors. So given that there is this clear intersection with protected characteristics, if you are trying to address low representation of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, then you are also going to contribute to improving the situation for people from different ethnic backgrounds, who are disabled, who are women. Obviously, you still need bespoke programs for people with specific characteristics, but it's not a either one or the other. Looking at social issues, social background does help with other protected characteristics.
Thanks, Penelope. Would anybody like to add anything to that?
If I can just come in, I think I mean, intersectionality plays out in so many complex, compounding ways in this space. And so we do need to consider these, the barriers to our sector in a holistic way, but also recognizing that the interventions that we then work to co-design have to be fairly targeted. So something that I've seen in the last few years in this space is when we talk a lot about, okay, the lack of diversity in the space, and it's awesome that we're moving forward with the lack of, the data we now have and the interventions we want to make to address low ethnic diversity in our space. Amazing. Like, God, I could never have imagined we'd be here even a few years ago. So it's great that we've started. But often what gets lost in that is a masking of some of those other nuances that exist. So, for example, the fact that the most disadvantaged group in our country is white working class boys, and they will not benefit, for example, from those other interventions that may be targeted at other areas of addressing diversity. So I think we've got to be mindful when we're designing those ways to make our sector more accessible, that we need to think about the different barriers that may exist. There's some that are the same and some that are very different.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and I think
I'll just build on that, David, and just say when we're designing our sort of solutions and the things that we want to, progress to take action, then we just need, be very, very mindful of the differences. And there are some areas where, you will be able to, by addressing, people who don't have any money to get on, that will help people from ethnic minority backgrounds as well. But also there are some other very real issues that you need a specific targeting to address as well. So I think it's sort of both.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think that question I asked about intersectionality addresses some of the questions in the Q&A around is lack of diversity and opportunities a class or a race issue, and another question they're asking about intersectionality exactly. So just thinking about, really, we talked a little bit about employers and employment and entry level, etc. And I know that, Alex, you're fed up with people asking for your LinkedIn profile, but you haven't got one. Coming back to, really, if there was a leader or an employer within an organisation that employed people in the marine and coastal sector, and they were unconvinced by this, what would you say to them so they should prioritise social mobility or improving social mobility into their organisation? How would you kind of convince them that it is an important issue to consider? Alex?
Can I speak to this one? Yeah, I mean, I think because overall, it benefits the organisation. It makes them, better as an organisation. A good example is this. Oftentimes, specifically in advocacy work, people in the marine space can be seen as a bit out of touch. And I think that is a product of the fact that the people actually working for those companies all come from very similar backgrounds. If you had people from a more sort of diverse background, I think it would be easier to I think you could craft better messages and not be seen in that way.
Thank you. Emily, did you raise your hand, I think?
Yeah, thank you. I touched on this a little bit at the end, but to me, this is not a nice to have. This is not additional. This is absolutely mission critical for us who are working in the marine and coastal space. For us to deliver this mission of, we can term it thriving coast, thriving seas, whatever, we need to work with coastal communities. And across the board, like in the chat, it was amazing talking about, proximity to the sea does not in any way correlate with passion for ocean recovery, however we want to term it. And I know people's motivations for working in this sector are different, but to really deliver that, what we're talking about, we need to have a much greater plurality of voices who are inputting into decision making at all levels. So whether that's like political, as Alex has talked about, in the governance of NGOs, in the practice and how we actually go out onto the streets and do this work, that only gets stronger and more effective when we have people from those communities or people from a different lived experience there. So that's not just socio-economic background, it's all the different protected characteristics we see. And so I think that when I was on the board at Marine Conservation Society, I had exactly this situation. So I was, youngish, fairly passionate, obviously, about social justice and asked to step in to be their first ever equity and diversity and inclusion lead, which I was honoured to do, but I'm not an EDI professional. I'm a marine biologist that really cares and has a working class background and wanted to try and tackle a lot of the homogeneity in the sector. And so the way that I tried to change hearts and minds was trying to get people to focus that this is central to the mission. And so if my one advice to anybody who wants to try and create change in their organisation when they advocate about this is making sure it doesn't get othered or tick boxed. It's not that, it's absolutely essential for what we are trying to do as a sector, the world we want to see, we need to see.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, David, I completely agree with what Emily and Alex said there. And I think that especially because in the marine and coastal sector, because of the work we are doing, often is at the interface of in communities that are incredibly struggling, and they will not. We need to make sure that they can see the benefits and the value of the work that we are doing. I mean, I think that that's something when we're making the case for why we need to invest in working at our coast and our seas. We often talk about the benefits to people and communities, and we need to just be able to make sure that we are actually delivering that, and we can only do that by talking to and working with and inviting in those people as well.
Thank you. That's great. So there's loads of questions coming into the Q&A. As I mentioned right at the top of this webinar, we're going to put this recording out as well as a short report. So we'll try and collate all these questions. We might put some of them to the panelists, see if they've got time to answer it, and maybe some references as well, because there's somebody in the Q&A has asked about the data and the source for the white middle class, or white working class rather, boys being underprivileged. So we'll dig that out and send that around. Just another quick question here, really, if it is a quick question. The question is around, we're focusing a lot on entry roles into careers, but they would love to ask or hear the speakers think how that class, ethnicity, disabilities impacts people's careers throughout. So, for example, on promotions and opportunities and development in mid-level careers. I don't know if you want to answer that, Penelope, or if somebody else has got something to say on that kind of progression rather than entry.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know. I don't have the data for the sector, but in other sectors, unfortunately, there is just a pretty consistent pattern that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, even though well, there is variance, but even where they outperform people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, they are still less likely to be promoted, and they progress more slowly through the organisation. Yeah, so that that's just a business case, isn't it? You want the people who are good at their job to be progressing to the top positions.
Yeah.
I think there's something really cultural, isn't there, in that, around learned behaviours about from different classes, about being able to talk about what you're doing and actually even being able to say, I want that job. It took me a very long time to even be able to think and articulate that I was allowed to, Emily, you mentioned that, being told, oh, you'll never, you'll never get that. And so you sort of internalise that, and you just think, oh, if I'm just like keep my head down and do well, then but it was only from realising, talking and, like I said, being part of civil service social mobility network, that really helped me just really understand that actually there were ways that I could take a more proactive role. One tip I would give people is, think about spot mentoring. Like, you can just approach someone and just say, oh, I really think you've got a great job, I'd love to find out more. And I found that terrifying, but actually when I started doing that, I had some really great conversations, and that helped me articulate my own sort of ambition as well to progress. So I think, and also gets you on the radar of people, knowing that and that's, I think, upper class, high middle class people, upper class people, they might just know to do that, but I think I had no idea that we were meant to do that.
Emily?
Thank you. I was going to make exactly the same point, Rose, is the mentoring point and the mindset. So I mentioned it earlier about class being a mindset, and my husband and I have talked about this a lot, and I got an MBE earlier this year, which is just still mind-blowing, because I still feel like people like me don't get MBEs, right? And so no matter how many times I have this conversation, that I think there's always going to be this internalized classism of, we are brought up to get our heads down, graft, not take up space, and not get above ourselves. That is something that comes from within our community, not necessarily without. And I think that retraining my brain, retraining that social conditioning to believe that I was worthy and able to access these things is, that's 10, 15 years of work. And so how do we make sure that we're as a sector saying, no, you belong here in these positions, not just in the sector, but in positions of leadership and positions of influence. And I think mentoring can really help, so we can build that, support each other, help bring each other up. And so mentoring can be within the same level, or it can be up, down. I didn't know about mentors until I was probably 30. I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know I was allowed to ask for help. And then you actually get that, and you realise that in other areas of society, that's much more normal to help each other, to make introductions, to do this, to have somebody champion you in rooms that you're not necessarily in. And so I would encourage people, particularly young people. I put a link in the chat. There's a Focus on Nature's mentor network. That's incredible. It's free. It's open to anybody 18 to 30. And I think we've touched on the really important issue. There's the recruitment, getting into the sector, early career stuff, and then there's the retention bit, because I see as well, even people who have done incredibly well and proven themselves, they are hemorrhaged, they are lost out of our sector, because the wages are poor. It's hard to live in the places you need to live. If it's, your wages are difficult, you get to an age where you want to have children or move away or build a different life, and those things we really need to tackle. So it's not just getting people into the sector, but keeping them in, so when we've got that experience, people can continue to thrive. And I genuinely think that there's still the kind of class / socio-economic factor that influences how well or not people can continue to thrive in this space as they get to kind of mortgage level. So thank you.
Thanks. We're kind of drawing towards a close, and just to say, we'll leave the webinar open for a little bit, so if people want to chat for a bit longer before we close it, please carry on doing that. I just wanted to come to you, Alex, just before we finish, and to the others if they have a view. Really, we talked a lot about I guess the issues, the problems, but I just want to kind of finish on perhaps some solutions or some ideas, really. So I guess, what would you say to an organization, how can they make change? If someone's really open to change, what practical steps can they do next, really, for this change? So it'd be interesting to hear of what would have been useful for any of you, really, or what has been useful to you, to an organization that wants to make change in this space, really. Can I start with you, Alex?
Well, that's a tricky one. I mean, I do think reassessing the way we look at candidates for jobs, I think there is one of the issues is, I think there is an overemphasis on, sort of, the work experience and education. And whilst that makes sense, obviously you want people that are qualified. Of course, that's going to naturally exclude people that have maybe left school early, such as myself, and other folks. So I do think taking a more sort of holistic view of candidates and not just focusing on that work experience and education, look at other things, other skills that they may possess. I also think sort of exposing more people, especially younger people, I think is important, because there was a question I saw by Andrew, and I totally agree with it. I did not know this sector existed. I guarantee you no one I grew up with knew it existed at all. So those would be my two big things.
Great. Thanks, Alex. I'm going to come to you next, Rose.
So I think if for organisations, if you have, an EDI strategy, just being very explicit about including class and socio-economic status within that. And like Penelope said, there's some really good, easy ways that you can measure that. I mean, we also use, measuring parents' occupation at 14. So I think that and there's some robust research behind that about why that's a good measure to use. It's a really small thing to include, and then you can track your, we look at that in terms of our board and in our organisation. I think, like Alex said, recruitment practices are really important, and there's lots that we can do. But Actually, I think it's this webinar is great, right? Because actually, I think it's about making space for a conversation, and I certainly, the more that I've been able to talk about it and speak to other people that are like, yes, that's I recognise that, and I think that allows us to like also tackle some of those voices in our heads, as well as be able to share understand like the barriers and what we might do. So I would say just make space for conversations about it. Really important.
Thanks, Rose. Penelope?
Sorry, on mute. Yeah, Rose, so you've already said one point I was going to do. So gather data. It just shows you where you are and then lets you evaluate whether what what you do about it is actually having any impact. The second thing I would say is to start having the conversations so that people do get comfortable talking about class, about socio-economic background, about social mobility, and that will help you make progress.
Thanks, Penelope. And finally, Emily.
Thank you. Whilst I think data is incredibly valuable and is important for measuring change in how we're tackling this, I think there are things that are lost when we just look at pure numbers. And so we need to make sure that when we're tackling this issue, particularly if you are somebody who wants to make this better but aren't from this background, is making sure you speak with and create a safe, inclusive space for people who have lived this experience to talk to you. And I think for all of us here, I don't want to speak for anybody, but bearing your soul and talking about how difficult it's been is really, really hard. And it is a big burden for us. It's not up to us alone to change this, the barriers in this sector, but listen to us. Create spaces for working class people from different backgrounds. Working class is a big catch-all. It's 51% of society. There's white working class, there's people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds of different races. All of those factors need to be considered when you look at those interventions as how you can make this better, and trust that we know what needs to change. But it's not just up to us to do the work.
Right, thank you. It's a good place to end. Thank you, Emily. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I think part of what we wanted to do today was create that space for the conversation, as someone said earlier, and we want to kind of keep that space going, really. Yeah, so thanks to the panelists here today, to Emily Cunningham MBE, Rose O'Neill, Alex Gill, and Penelope Griffin. It's been great having you. Thanks to all the people online for watching. This recording will be on the OCF website and YouTube channel soon, and look out for the next in the Ocean Justice series, which will be coming along quite soon as well. As I said earlier, we'll put out a report. We'll try and capture some of these questions. We'll try and put some of the information and data in our report when it comes out. So thank you all for watching, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.